God, it was a disaster, Jed. So here's the underlying thing here. The U.S. Navy operates this program on the assumption that the Soviet Union does this to us, and we don't attack the ships, and so therefore our ships will be safe doing it off the coasts of communist nations. And I mean, we can have a larger discussion here about how this sort of encapsulates the Cold War, and I think it really does. Like, this is the American government saying, since the Soviets do this to us, all communist bloc states will respect and react the same way that they do, and never really gave any thought to the idea that there are specific differences within the communist bloc nations. And so when the American government sat down to start this program, really the idea of protecting these ships or keeping them safe was just not very important. It was assumed that you could send a falling apart tugboat right off the coasts of any of these nations, and it would be fine, because the international sort of accepted norms of behavior were that we accepted these ships, you didn't want them inside your territorial waters, but even if they strayed in, you just sort of gave them a warning and sent them on their way. And so that meant, in the eyes of American planners, particularly those trying to, keep things pretty cheap in terms of conversion, that all the Pueblo needed to be, like the Banner and the Palm Beach and the other ships, all it needed to do is be able to float. Right? I mean, if this thing could get from point A to point B, let's sink our money into intelligence collection materials and not worry about anything else. And so the Navy dramatically slashed the budget to convert the ship and get it seaworthy. And as a result, it was a complete disaster. Now, I mean, I could fill your entire podcast with a litany of disasters in terms of conversion, but I'll give you just a couple of examples.
Sure, yep.
The ship's steering engine was so bad that it was constantly slipping out of gear. And even just a couple months before the ship was sent to North Korea, on all of its in-service tests, its sort of pre-mission tests, they kept having to be dragged in by tugboat.
Yeah, at one point you mentioned that on its first day of testing, it lasted 20 or 15 minutes at sea and had to get dragged back in?
Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, we're sending this ship to North Korea, for God's sakes. This isn't a vacation cruise in the Bahamas. You're sending a ship to operate for the first time in North Korea, and I'm sure down the road you and I can talk about what things are like in North Korea in 1968.
Yep.
But their assumption was that the ship would be safe. So they didn't care that the ship didn't really have a self-destruct mechanism. I mean, it had a very, very basic system, but nothing that could do the job. They didn't care that the ship didn't have adequate equipment to destroy the classified gear and classified materials. They didn't even give it an incinerator to burn the papers that they had accumulated. In order to destroy the top-secret code radios that were encased in steel and built into the wall, they gave them fire axes and sledgehammers, which were useless. To get rid of the top-secret intelligence documents that they were carrying, they gave them 22 weighted bags, and they said, fill the bags with the paper and throw it overboard, which doesn't make much sense when the whole point of the ship is to operate right near the coast of an enemy state. So it was disaster after disaster.
So let's flush out
of the critical decisions.
Sorry, I'll just get you to flush out that first point just before we push on. You said one of the great failures in this was the inability of the American government to understand that North Korea wasn't just another communist puppet, that they may react differently to how the Soviet Union or other closer allies to the Soviet Union would react.
Yeah, so that's the underlying failure here. And just as we were talking a minute ago about how that made it so that the military people in charge weren't so concerned about the safety and stability of the ship, it kind of encompassed every aspect of the Pueblo, and it's really the defining element of this period of the Cold War. So when the intelligence community does its mission assessment evaluation, they operate on the assumption that the ship is going to be safe because the Soviets do this to the United States and we accept it. And so if you go through sort of the checklists of all the points that the intelligence community was supposed to evaluate before they could approve this ship as a minimal risk, you can only go on the mission if all the different intelligence levels evaluated the mission and said this was a minimal risk. Well, some of the criteria, there's no way this was minimal risk, right? The criteria included things like the political sensitivity of the target nation, right? I mean, this is North Korea. Some of the other things included the weather and previous missions. I mean, there were all sorts of red flags. And yet, inside the military, inside the intelligence circles, inside the Johnson administration, the assumption was that, there's us versus them. And inside the communist bloc, they were all sort of servile puppets of the Chinese and the Soviets, and as long as the superpowers were on board, their behavior would be predictable. So that's the story of the Pueblo in a nutshell, and in a sense, that's the story of the Cold War.